It's a Friday night in 1962. The sun has barely dipped below the horizon, and Main Street is already alive. You can hear them before you see them, the low rumble of V8 engines, the crackle of AM radio spilling out of rolled down windows, the occasional bark of tires on warm asphalt. A line of cars stretches 3 blocks in both directions, moving slow, windows down, arms hanging out into the summer air. This is cruising. And for about 3 decades in America, it was the heartbeat of teenage life. There was nothing quite like it, before or since. It wasn't a sport. It wasn't organized. Nobody sold tickets, nobody kept score. It was just young people, moving through their towns together, feeling the specific and electric freedom of being alive and behind the wheel on a Friday night. And somewhere between Vietnam and the internet, it quietly disappeared. Tonight we're going to talk about how it started, what it meant, and, maybe more importantly, why it's gone. To understand teen car culture in America, you have to understand what the car meant in the first place. Before the 1950s, most American teenagers didn't have much of a world of their own. They went to school, came home, helped with chores, maybe held a part-time job. Social life was supervised, structured, and almost always in the presence of adults. Then came the post-war boom. Factories that had been building tanks and Jeeps started building Chevrolets and Fords. Gas was cheap, cheaper than cheap, and the roads were getting better every year. And suddenly, for the first time in history, a working teenager could save up enough from a summer job to buy a used car. That car wasn't just transportation. It was a door. It was a declaration. It said, for the first time, I can go somewhere without you. The culture built up fast. By the mid-1950s, teenagers across America had quietly claimed the automobile as their own. And they did something interesting with it, they made it beautiful. The custom car scene was exploding, especially in California, where kids were lowering suspensions, chopping rooflines, pinstriping hoods, and painting their cars in colors that had no business being on a machine. These weren't rich kids. These were the sons of mechanics and steelworkers who taught themselves body work in the driveway on Sunday afternoons. The car became a canvas, and the culture around it became something genuinely artistic and deeply American. And then there was the ritual of cruising itself. Every town had a strip, a stretch of road, usually the main commercial drag, that became the unofficial track. In Los Angeles, it was Van Nuys Boulevard. In Modesto, California, it was 10th and 11th Streets. In small towns across the Midwest and South, it was whatever stretch of road had the most traffic lights, the best diners on the corners, and enough room to make a slow, satisfying loop. The rules were unspoken but universally understood. You drove slow. You waved. You honked. You pulled into a parking lot to talk to someone, and if you were lucky, maybe you drove away with company. It sounds simple because it was simple. That was exactly the point. Anchoring the whole scene were the drive-ins, and when we say drive-ins, we mean both the movie theaters and the restaurants, because both were absolutely essential. The drive-in movie theater was invented in the 1930s but didn't really take off until after the war, and by the late 1950s there were more than 4,000 of them scattered across the country. They were perfectly designed for teenagers, almost by accident. You paid per carload, which meant a bunch of friends could pile in for the price of a tank of gas. You didn't have to dress up, you didn't have to be quiet, and the management wasn't exactly hovering over your shoulder. The back rows of drive-in theaters became legendary, not always for the movies, which is probably all we need to say about that. The drive-in restaurants were a different kind of magic. Places like Sonic, A&W, and thousands of local independents with names like the Frosty Freeze or the Rocket Drive-In built their whole business around the car. Kerhops, most of them teenage girls in short skirts, some of them on roller skates, would glide out to your window, take your order, and come back balancing a tray that hooked right onto your door. You'd sit there for an hour over a milkshake and a basket of onion rings, watching other cars come and go, running into everyone you knew, having conversations through rolled down windows. It was social media before social media. It was connection in an era before we had to be told to connect. Now, it would be easy to romanticize all of this, and honestly, a little bit of romance is probably earned. But it's worth being honest about what this culture also contained. Cruising strips were segregated in many parts of the country, openly or quietly. The freedom of the open road was not equally available to every American teenager, and the post-war prosperity that put those cars in those driveways was itself distributed very unevenly. The rebel without a cause mythology of teen car culture left out a lot of teenagers. That's part of the story too, but even with those caveats firmly in place, something real was lost when this culture faded. And it didn't fade all at once, it eroded slowly, through a combination of forces that arrived one by one, none of them fatal on their own, but together adding up to something irreversible. The first blow came in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and it came from Washington. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration began imposing new safety and emissions standards that fundamentally changed how American cars were designed and built. The muscle cars, the Chargers, the GTOs, the Mustangs with their big block engines, got strangled by emissions restrictions and liability concerns. Insurance rates for young male drivers shot up dramatically. The cars that had defined the culture became expensive to own and expensive to drive. The romance was being legislated away, one regulation at a time, and there wasn't much teenagers could do about it. Then came the oil crises of 1973 and 1979. When OPEC tightened the supply and gas prices spiked overnight, cruising a strip for 2 hours on a Friday night suddenly wasn't a casual thing to do. It cost money. Real money. And the cultural message around cars began to shift. Where the car had been a symbol of freedom and identity and pure American possibility, it was now increasingly a symbol of consumption, waste, pollution. The counterculture of the late 1960s had already started viewing the car with a certain suspicion. The automobile was part of the system, man, and now mainstream culture was catching up. The car was getting less cool. And for teen culture, that was a significant problem. Meanwhile, the physical spaces that had hosted this whole social world were disappearing. Drive-in theaters were expensive to maintain and sitting on increasingly valuable real estate. Through the 1970s and 1980s, they closed by the hundreds. By 1990, there were fewer than 1,000 left in the entire country, down from that peak of over 4,000. The Walmart went up where the Starlight Drive-In used to be. The strip mall replaced the cruising strip. The architecture of teen social life was being demolished, one parking lot at a time. The shopping mall, ironically, tried to fill that void. For a while in the 1980s, the mall became a legitimate teen gathering place. You'd hang out, you'd see people, you'd drift from store to store without buying anything. But the mall was enclosed. It was climate controlled. It was watched over by security guards whose job was specifically to prevent the kind of unstructured loitering that was the whole point. The mall gave teenagers a place to be, but it didn't give them freedom. And freedom had always been the thing, and then the 1990s arrived, and with them came the crackdown. Cities and towns across America, responding to concerns about noise and traffic and, let's be honest, about what teenagers were actually up to, began passing anti-cruising ordinances. Van Nuys Boulevard, the legendary Los Angeles cruising strip, was shut down by the city in 1980 after years of complaints. Main streets across the country followed suit. You could only drive the same stretch a certain number of times per hour. Officers were stationed to turn back repeat passers. The legal apparatus of the American town was deployed against its own teenagers, and the teenagers, lacking lawyers and voting rights, mostly just went home. What they went home to, increasingly, was cable television. Then video games. Then the internet. And by the mid-2000s, social media. Each of these technologies offered something the cruising strip had once provided: connection, community, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself, but delivered it without requiring you to leave your room, without requiring a car, without requiring the terrifying vulnerability of actually showing up somewhere in person and hoping someone would be glad to see you. Teenagers didn't abandon car culture because they stopped caring about connection. They abandoned it because they found connection somewhere that felt safer and cheaper and infinitely more available. There's one more factor that doesn't get talked about enough, and it's this: American teenagers are driving less than any generation in decades, and many of them aren't getting licenses at all. Studies done in the last 10 years consistently show that the percentage of 16 and 17-year-olds with driver's licenses has dropped sharply since its peak in the 1980s. Some of this is economic: cars are expensive, insurance is expensive, and young people are carrying more financial pressure than their parents did at the same age. But some of it is cultural. The car simply doesn't mean what it once meant. The freedom it represents is available through a screen. The identity it offered has migrated somewhere else. The rite of passage has quietly been retired, and yet, there are holdouts. There are cruise nights in small towns every summer, organized affairs with registration forms and judges and trophies, and they draw enormous crowds of people who remember what Friday night used to feel like. The Barrett-Jackson car auctions pull in millions of viewers who will never be able to afford what they're watching. The custom car shows that happen in parking lots on weekend mornings in cities across the country are packed with enthusiasts who still believe that what you drive says something true about who you are. The flame didn't go out entirely. It just went underground. What we lost when teen car culture faded wasn't really about the cars. The cars were just the vessel. What we lost was a particular kind of public social life, unorganized, unhurried, geographically rooted in a specific place that belonged to the community. The cruising strip worked because everyone knew where it was, everyone showed up, and the whole machinery of it ran on nothing more than shared habit and the desire to be among your own people on a Friday night. You didn't need an app. You didn't need a reservation. You just went. Whether that can come back is genuinely hard to say. The conditions that created it were specific to a particular moment in American history: cheap gas, cheap cars, open roads, post-war optimism, and a generation of teenagers who had just been handed something they'd never had before. Those conditions are gone. But the hunger underneath them, the desire to be somewhere, among people, alive to the night and free from the house and moving through the world, that hasn't gone anywhere. It's just waiting for someone to build it a new home.